So there are two things you should be doing right now, even in the winter, to keep your garden in good shape over the long term. Number one, what's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having a fantastic day. It is Wednesday, December 18th here in South Georgia. And a few videos ago, we talked about some things you could still plant right now if you live in an area where the winters aren't too rough. But what if you don't want to plant anything right now? What should you be doing in your garden this winter to have it in nice shape, ready to go for spring planting? So there are two things you should be doing right now, even in the winter, to keep your garden in good shape over the long term. Number one would be not letting those winter weeds get the best of you. And number two would be building up some soil nutrition, keeping that soil alive so it's in good shape come spring. So on this video, we'll go through those two things in detail, and I'll show you a few options for accomplishing each. So let's start out with the weeds. Now in the winter months, we deal with a completely different set of weeds than we do in the warmer months. And the ones we deal with the most during the winter down here would be chickweed and then henbit. We got one of each right side by side there. Now the henbit's pretty easy to manage if you don't let it go to seed. You can pull it up really easily or just flip it over with a hoe and it will usually die when the sun comes out. The chickweed is a different story because it will regrow from tiny little fragments that you leave in the soil there. It's really hard to get rid of it once it establishes. And if you let the chickweed go crazy one year, you're guaranteed to have an even worse chickweed problem the next year. That's why we want to try to keep the weed growth to a minimum right now so it doesn't cause us issues down the road. Now some people might say, well, I'm not really worried about those winter weeds because they're going to die off when it gets hot again anyways. But if you're going to be using your garden in the winter months going forward, you don't want to keep escalating those winter weed problems, making them worse year over year. And so there's a few different options for controlling or managing these winter weeds. I'll mention four. So number one, and probably the best option, would be to plant a cool season cover crop. Now it may be too late for many of y'all to plant a cool season cover crop, but this is probably the best option for soil health. Our girls have already made one round grazing this plot here, and I'm about to put them back on it once this recovers a little bit more, maybe give it a few more days to grow back some. Option number two would be to add mulch. Wait on those winter weed seeds to germinate and then smother them out with some mulch. Now, I'm not a big mulcher around here, but it's a good option if you have access to mulch or like mulching your garden. Just make sure you add enough so it smothers out those weeds and they don't creep up through the mulch. You could use wood chips. A lot of people use that. You could even use a thick layer of compost as a mulch. And then option number three, which I'm a big fan of, is using a tarp. So this plot had some winter weed emergence. They hadn't gotten too big, but they were starting to cover the soil there. So we put down this tarp, which is going to exclude light, going to kill any of those weeds that are already there, and hopefully force more winter weed seeds to germinate and kill those as well. And then option number four, if you like getting your hands dirty, just aggravate those weeds to death. Just do some frequent shallow cultivation every couple weeks. Grab your favorite hand hoe and just lightly scratch the surface of the soil, disturbing those weeds so they don't thrive. If you've got raised beds, you don't even need a garden tool for this. A lot of times you can just take your hand and just scuffle up that first inch or two of soil and accomplish what you need to do. So those are four relatively simple ways to keep the winter weeds from becoming an even worse headache in future years. Some of those ways require more work than others. Some may require more money than others, but you've got plenty of options there depending on what you have on hand. Now let's talk about building nutrients and keeping those soils alive. Hopefully your soil has some level of microbial activity, and you don't want to leave those microbes without anything to eat or they're just going to quickly die. So we want to keep feeding that soil and also building up some good nutrition or a base of nutrients so when we plant in the spring, we've got some stuff there that our plants can use. Now here in a minute, I'm going to demonstrate how we do this in one of my raised beds back here, but there's several different things you could add to your soils right now that are going to benefit whatever you plant in the spring. So you could apply some type of organic fertilizer, whether that be granular or liquid. You could also add some worm castings and some worms if you have some of those on hand. You could use some manure-based compost or just some really nice finished compost that you have. Lots of different things you could add to accomplish this goal. So let's walk over to one of these raised beds right behind me where we just took out some pepper plants, and I'll show you how we start building that nutrition and getting this bed ready to plant taters here in just a few months. Now step one would be what we've already done here: remove the dead plants that have been killed by the frost. And you can see my graveyard right here. Some of those ageratum plants did have a few green leaves still at the bottom, but it was just a matter of time before subsequent freezes killed them all the way back. Also, if you had trellis plants in the bed, you want to make sure you remove any string, especially if it's non-biodegradable string like we use, and also remove any Dairy Queen spoons you might find. Also, if you're using drip irrigation, not a bad idea to get it out of the way so it's easier to work and them in the bed. So I'm just going to remove this entire setup here. I've already pulled up the staples, so I'm just going to take this off right here. I'll put it back in a minute when we're done, but we'll get it out of the way for now. And we also probably want to get rid of this chickweed here, or as much of it as we can. Hard to remove all this because it fragments up so easily, but we're going to try to get at least the big pieces of it. Alright, that looks better already. We got some dried pepper leaves on top of that soil, but we're not really going to worry about those. And one thing I didn't mention earlier, but that we've covered on past videos, if you can, try to leave the roots from the previous crop in the soil. You can see that pepper stump right there. Now I did have to pull up a couple of those ageratum plants because they were wrapped around my drip tape, but I tried to leave as much of the root structure in the soil as possible. And now for the amending part, where you can add granular organic fertilizer, liquid organic fertilizer, worm castings, manure-based compost, whatever you have to feed that soil. I'll be using the Coop Grow here, this granular stuff, because that's what I keep on hand. And I'm going to be fairly liberal with my application here because I know I'm not planting anything here for a couple months. I want to build that nice nutrient base for when we do plant potatoes here, say mid to late February. Now an important thing to consider here, if you know, is what you'll be planting here next. So I'm going to be planting potatoes here. Potatoes are something that needs hilling, and I learned my lesson last year about having these beds too full, and you can't really hill them when they're too full. So I'm not going to be adding any soil or potting mix or anything like that, compost on top of this bed at the moment. If we were planting something different than potatoes, yes, I would go ahead and top this bed off here. But since we're going to need to leave some room to add some soil to those potatoes as they grow, I'm just going to lightly scratch that fertilizer into the soil. I have to work around these roots a little bit, just give it a light incorporation there. And then lastly, we put our drip irrigation back down so it will run when we're watering all these other beds out here. We want to make sure the soil doesn't get really dry. I want to keep it relatively moist because if we let it dry out and just get baked dry, that's going to defeat the purpose of what we just did. And circling back to those winter weed management strategies I talked about earlier, what we'll do in that bed there is that fourth option where we'll just do some frequent shallow cultivation, just lightly disturb that top inch or two of soil to keep any more weeds from thriving. So I'll just go out there every week or two, only take a minute to scratch around with this guy right here and keep any chickweed from establishing any further in that bed. So hopefully that gives you some ideas of some things you can be and need to be doing right now if you're not growing veggies in all or a part of your backyard garden. And do let me know in the comments below which of those winter weed strategies you use and what you add to your beds to get them ready to plant in the spring. What you put in there to keep those soils nice and alive and nutrient dense. And as always, you can find that Coop Grow fertilizer and a lot of the other products we use around here on our website at lazydogfarm.com. If you want to know more about our drip irrigation system for the raised beds, watch this video right here. We'll show you the install we did a few years ago that makes it really easy to pull it out, amend the bed, and put it right back in. So check that out, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.